Hi students, welcome to this video on active-passive voice. As I've already discussed about the active voice in my earlier videos, which was English grammar step 1 to step 7, so I'm moving forward with the passive voice now. A passive voice is used to show interest in the person or object that experiences an action rather than the person or object that performs the action. In other words, the most important thing or person becomes the subject of the sentence. So like I earlier discussed about what a sentence is made up of, it is made up of a subject plus verb plus the object. So here you can see what happens in the passive voice is that the object becomes the subject and subject becomes the object. So we will talk about it in details now. So generally we use the passive when the focus is on the action and not on who or what is performing the action. So that's what you need to remember. All right, so moving ahead, we will do a step-by-step process. The first will be the simple present. We use the simple present to express the idea that an action is repeated or usual. The action can be a habit, a hobby, a daily event, a scheduled event, or something that often happens. In passive voice, we focus attention on the person or thing affected by the action when the subject is unknown, unclear, or irrelevant. Now you see the way we make a sentence for the active voice, it is subject plus V1 plus object. Now on the other hand, the passive will be object becomes the subject. So here I'll start my sentence with the object. Then I will talk about the auxiliary verbs, which is, am, are, and I will use the verb third form, and this I've already discussed in my earlier videos. And then I'm going to use by with the subject, or I can use a prepositional phrase. So let's take an example. The first is she reads magazines. Now magazines are read by her, so I will use the verb third form in the sentence, and magazine has become the object and she has become her, which is the subject. She reads a magazine, so a magazine is read by her, so you have to see the singular and plural as well. They read magazines, magazines are read by them. Now simple present, if we talk about the same sentences in the negative form, so for active, it will be subject plus doesn't or don't I will use with the verb first form plus the object. And on the other hand, the passive voice will be object plus I can use isn't or aren't with the verb third form with by and the subject with the prepositional phrase. So the example will be she doesn't read magazines. Magazines aren't read by her. She doesn't read a magazine. A magazine isn't read by her. They don't read magazines. Magazines aren't read by them. Now, if we have to talk about the interrogative, which is making a question out of the same sentences, how will that be? The formation for the active voice will be, I will start my question with does or do with the subject plus verb first form and the object with a question mark. And on the other hand, the passive voice, I will start my question with is or are with object and verb third form with by and the subject or prepositional phrase. So the same sentence, if I have to change it to an interrogative, it will be, does she read magazines? Are magazines read by her? Does she read a magazine? Is magazine read by her? Do they read magazines? Are magazines read by them? So I hope this clarifies simple present. Now Moving on to the simple past, the past simple passive is normally used to talk about some completed actions in the past. In the passive voice, emphasis is put on the effect of an action rather than on the doer. So the active voice, the sentence is subject with the verb second form and object, and on the other hand with the passive voice it will be object plus was or were with the verb third form with by and subject with the prepositional phrase. So the first sentence will be he opened the gift. Now if I have to change this to passive, the gift was opened by him. They opened many gifts. Many gifts were opened by them. Now, talking about the negative of the simple past, again with the active voice, I will say subject. I will use didn't here, which is did not. And always remember, it is a rule that with did not, I will always use the first form of the verb plus the object. Now, passive voice will be object plus wasn't or weren't with the verb third form plus by and subject or prepositional phrase in the end. Now, the sentence I can take is he didn't open the gift. The gift wasn't opened by him. They didn't open many gifts. Many gifts weren't opened by them. Now moving on to the simple past interrogative, which is the question. The active voice will be did. So I will start my question with did, with then the subject, then verb first form and the object with the question mark. And on the other hand, the passive voice will be was or were with object plus verb third form plus by plus the subject or prepositional phrase with a question mark. So my sentence will be, did he open the gift? Was the gift opened by him? Did they open many gifts? Were many gifts opened by them? Alright, now moving on to the present continuous. We use the present continuous passive for actions happening right now or in progress at the moment of speaking when we want to focus attention on the person or thing affected by the action, when the subject is unknown, unclear, or irrelevant. Now talking about the active voice, present continuous, as I already discussed in details in my earlier videos, it is going to start with the subject plus is, am, are, which is auxiliary verbs plus V1, and I will use an ing after the verb with the object. On the other hand, the passive voice will be object plus the auxiliary verbs is, am, are, plus I will also use being plus the verb third form, then by, and then the subject with the prepositional phrase. So the first sentence for an example is Tim is eating an apple. An apple is being eaten by Tim. Sarah is watching birds. Birds are being watched by Sarah. Now talking about the negative of the present continuous, in active form, I will use subject plus isn't or ain't or aren't with the verb first form, then ing and object, and on the other hand, passive voice will be object plus isn't or ain't or aren't with being plus verb third form and by with the subject prepositional phrase. So the same example will be changed like Tim isn't eating an apple. An apple isn't being eaten by Tim. Sarah isn't watching birds. Birds aren't being watched by Sarah. And if I have to now change it to the interrogator, which is a question, for the active voice, I'm going to use is, am, are, going to start, then the subject, then V1 ing and the object with a question mark. And on the other hand, the passive voice will be is, am, are plus object plus being plus verb third form and by and the subject with the or prepositional phrase. So the example again changes into is Tim eating an apple? Is an apple being eaten by Tim? So please remove the is after apple and Tim. So the correct sentence is Tim eating an apple? Is an apple being eaten by Tim? Is Sarah watching birds? Are birds being watched by Sarah? Alright, moving on to the past continuous. We use the past continuous passive to describe actions or events happening at a definite moment in the past when we want to focus attention on the person or thing affected by the action, when the subject is unknown, unclear, or irrelevant, and when we talk about general truths. Now here, the sentence formation for the past active voice will be subject with the was, were plus V1 ing and object, and on the other hand with the passive voice it will be object plus was, were with being, verb third form, by, and subject or preposition phrase. So the first example will be Tim was eating an apple was being eaten by Tim. They were watching birds were being watched by them. Now the negative of the same will be in the active form. It is subject plus wasn't or weren't with verb first form with ing and object, and on the other hand with the passive it will be object plus wasn't, weren't with being, verb third form, and by, and the subject or prepositional phrase. So the first example will be Tim wasn't eating an apple wasn't being eaten by Tim. They weren't watching birds weren't being watched by them. And now talking about the interrogative in the active form, it'll be, I'm going to start my question with was or were with subject, V1 ing and object with a question mark. And passive voice will again start with was, were with object. I am going to use being plus V3 plus by, and then the subject with the prepositional phrase with a question mark. So my first example will be, was Tim eating an apple? Was apple being eaten by Tim? Were they watching birds? Were birds being watched by them? So now you know the difference between the present continuous and the past continuous passives. All right, moving on to the present perfect now. Present perfect passive is an English verb form that has the present tense, perfect aspect, and passive voice. So in the passive, a subject of the sentence is not the doer, it is the acted upon. We focus attention on what or who receives an action. So let's take a look at the sentence formation with the active voice. It will be subject plus has, have plus V3 plus object. And on the other hand, in the passive, it will be object plus has, have plus been with the verb third form and by and the subject or prepositional phrase. So the first example is, he has played guitar. Guitar has been played by him. Katie has submitted her project. Project has been submitted by Katie. Now, if I have to change the same sentences into negative, the active formation is going to be like subject plus hasn't or haven't with the verb third form and object. And with the passive, it will be object plus hasn't or haven't with been with verb third form, by, and subject or preposition phrase. So the same example changes to, he hasn't played guitar. Guitar hasn't been played by him. Katie hasn't submitted her project. Project hasn't been submitted by Katie. Now moving on to the interrogative, which was the question for the same sentences. With the active, I will start my sentence with has, have with subject and the verb third form and object with a question mark. On the other hand, with the passive, I'll start it with the has, have plus object plus been plus verb third form with by and subject or the preposition phrase with a question mark. So my first sentence will be, has he played guitar? Has guitar been played by him? Has Katie submitted her project? Has project been submitted by Katie? All right, talking about the past perfect passive, it expresses a previous action or state that began in the past and continued up to another point in the past, and its consequences have implications for that second point in time. So here, the active voice is generally subject plus had plus verb third form with the object, and the passive voice is object plus had with been, and then verb third form with by, subject, prepositional phrase. So the first example will be they had started the meeting. The meeting had been started by them. He had lost his car keys. The car keys had been lost by him. All right, then moving on to the negative of the same formation. With the active voice, I will say subject plus hadn't with the verb third form and object. And on the other hand, with passive, it will be object plus hadn't with been, verb third form with by, and subject or prepositional phrase. So my sentence will be they hadn't started the meeting. The meeting hadn't been started by them. He hadn't lost his car keys. The car keys hadn't been lost by him. Talking about the interrogative of the past perfect with the active voice, it will be had with subject, verb, third form, and object with a question mark. And with passive, it will be had with object and been with verb, third form, with by, subject, or prepositional phrase with a question mark. So the sentence will be had they started the meeting, had the meeting been started by them, had he lost his car keys, had the car keys been lost by him. Now talking about the present perfect continuous here with the active voice, I will say subject plus has or have with been with verb first form and ing and object, and with the passive it will be object is being and then the verb third form with by and subject or prepositional phrase. So generally we don't have a passive form for the perfect continuous tenses. That's why we have changed from has have to is being. So the sentence will be she has been riding bicycle since morning. Bicycle is being ridden by her since morning. He has been playing football for over 2 hours now. Football is being played by him for over 2 hours now. Past perfect continuous. Again, as we don't have the passive form, but we change it to a different form, like from subject with had been, verb first form ing and object and active. In the passive, we will use object plus was or were with being and verb third form with by and subject or prepositional phrase. So the sentence will be Jane had been learning Spanish for a month. Spanish was being learned by Jane for a month. They had been taking swimming classes since January. Swimming classes were being taken by them since January. Now talking about the simple future, we use simple future passive for actions or events that will happen in future, like tomorrow or next week, a month, a year, in 2022, 23, and so on. Now the formation will be an active voice subject plus will or shall with V1 and object, and on the other hand the passive will be object plus will shall plus be with the verb third form and by with the subject or prepositional phrase. So the first sentence will be he will buy a new laptop. Laptop will be bought by him. Landlord shall sign the contract. Contract shall be signed by the landlord. Now talking about the same sentences in the negative form, in active I will say subject plus won't or shan't plus the verb first form and object. And on the passive voice side, I will say object plus won't or shan't plus be with verb third form and by and subject or prepositional phrase. The same sentence changes like he won't buy a new laptop. Laptop won't be bought by him. Landlord shan't sign the contract. Contract shan't be signed by the landlord. And changing the same into interrogative in the active, I'll start by saying will or shall with subject with verb first form and object with a question mark. And on the other hand, with passive, I'll say will or shall with object or be with verb third form with by and subject or prepositional phrase with a question mark. So my first sentence will be, will he buy a new laptop? Will laptop be bought by him? Shall landlord sign the contract? Shall contract be signed by the landlord? Now future past. In future past in active, we say subject, and instead of will and shall, I say would or should with the verb first form and object. And in the passive voice, I'll say object plus would should with be, verb third form, by, or subject or prepositional phrase. So the first sentence will be, he should submit the assignment on time. The assignment should be submitted by him on time. Bookies would sell opera tickets quickly. Opera tickets would be sold by the bookies quickly. Now, future be going to. So when can we use going to in our sentences? Let's take a look at the active voice. I can say subject with the auxiliary verbs is, am, are with going to plus V1 and object. And on the other hand, the passive voice will be object plus is, am, are with the going to and be, verb third form and by and the subject or prepositional phrase. So this is the correct sentence formation for this particular going to. Now, the first sentence will be, he is going to organize an event. Event is going to be organized by him. They are going to set up the conference call and meeting. Conference call and meeting are going to be set up by them. Now, talking about the modals, the present form, modals, as we know, it is helping verbs that express possibility, ability, duty, permission, or advisability. Words like can, could, may, might, must, and should, and even will are all modals. We sometimes need the passive form of the modals, like we discussed now. So in active voice, subject plus may, can, must with the verb first form and object. And on the other hand, in the passive voice, object plus may, can, must with be and the verb third form plus by with the subject or prepositional phrase. So let's take a look at the first example. She may understand the proposal. The proposal may be understood by her. I can do this work. This work can be done by me. You must share your concern. Your concern must be shared. Now, talking about the modals in the past, the same will be changed. In active, I'll say subject instead of may, might. I'll say might, could, had to with the verb first form and object. And on the other hand, with passive, I'll say object with might or could or had to with be, verb third form, by, and the subject or the prepositional phrase. So the same sentence says, she might enjoy the concert. The concert might be enjoyed by her. I could do that work. This work could be done by me. You had to share your viewpoints. Your viewpoints had to be shared with the team. So let's take a look at few activities. The best activity is class dynamics. Now this is a tried and tested game that's been used with the passive voice for a long time. It's a lot of fun and easily adaptable to past and present tenses, although you may need to be creative if you want to use any future forms. So what you need to do is divide your class into teams and then send one member from each team out of the room for 1 to 2 minutes. Have other students move things in the room and then call the students back in and let them notice what changes you have done. So like in the first picture, you can see here that the table has been moved. So you can say the table has been moved or the chair is being moved and the curtains were being closed when I walked in. The second example will be a map. Like here you can see how the structure was in 1995 and what happened in present now. So whatever the changes have happened, you can notice and try and make sentences like, for example, fishing facility has been transformed into apartments. The car parking facility has been introduced. Farmland is now being converted into golf course and tennis courts. So thank you students for watching this video. Keep watching more English grammar videos and don't forget to subscribe to my channel.